Zal Bat Rus for Shlema.
And Hatzlacha for all the Chayalim.
Amen. Box a bit Masha.
Yep.
Being Khan Yunis, crazy times right now.
All right, we're going to do the last one. The last one is short, but it's kind of cool. We'll start with this one, just because I thought it's a nice way to start. Yud Zayin, the last one. It's got. All right, tell me when you're ready. Page. If you're in the English, it's page 424.
424.
I'm following you, so
I'm looking for it. It's the last one in Parshat Vayera.
Oh, okay.
It's got a little box in the middle there.
Yeah.
Not Vayera with an olive. Is it there? You got it? There we go. That's it.
Oh, you weren't kidding.
Okay, so an interesting, there's a lot of this week's Parsha Vayera is 7 of the Makot appear in this week's Parsha. And there are so many different ways to interpret the Makot. So of course, Zera Shimshon has a couple of ways to do it. One of them is an interesting way he identifies Yud Zayin, page, I don't know what daf that is.
We found it.
Okay, so I don't. So this is one way to do it. Is he notices that there are 3 makot. Yes, the last one. It's a very short one. We're starting with the short one just to get ourselves a little into things, and for those people who may want to leave a little early.
Prime the pump.
Exactly, prime the pump. So the question is, he notices, the Zera Shimshon notices, and there's a lot of things that you can notice when you look at the 10 makot together. You notice there's a lot of similarities between them. And there's also a lot of differences between them, and there's also a lot of common themes among them. So the Zera Shimshon picks up an interesting component based on, he quotes Al Pi Kabbalah, but it's not necessarily only Kabbalah. Anyway, so he says like this. The question is, Yesh latet ta'am. We have to give a reason. Lama b'makata kinim, hashchin v'achoshech. Why in the makav kinim, shchin, and choshech, Lo matzinu bahem hatra'al el paro kodam hamakah k'mo b'chol hashar makot. When looking at the different psukim, there's 3 makot that Moshe doesn't give any warning beforehand, and those are kinim, the lice, shchin, boils, and choshech, darkness. And he says,
Choshech is next week.
Choshech is next week, but like I said, he views it as, even though Choshech is next week officially in the Parsha, he views it as one set. Again, we're looking at 10 makot, so they were just like he bunches them all together, and 2 out of the 3 makot that he just mentioned are in this week's parsha anyway. So he kind of brings it together. So he says, "The ite be'al kutaru ve'inu b'shem haSefer HaPliyah." Sefer HaPliyah is a Kabbalistic work. I'm just quoting what it says here in article. A Kabbalistic work attributed by some to Rabbi Avigdor Kara of Prague. It also appears somewhere else as well. But either which way he says, "Shalosh makot hayu b'shamshot biyachad im kinim shchin v'choshech." B'chol makah shimsha achat shimsho shtayim achareb ima. So he says basically this Sefer HaPliyah, which is quoted in the Yalkut Ruveni, he says that there are 3 makot. These 3 makot, kinim, choshech, and shchin, all worked together. Whenever one of the makot, the other 2 served as basically what he calls it in our art school, they call it as auxiliaries, basically support, the support staff. Every one of them, there's an allusion to the connection between these 3 makot in each of the 3 Hebrew words. Kinam, shchin, and choshech. If you look at the way he sets it up in every one of the books, it's pretty much the same. But kinam, shchin, and choshech, you can see that if you look at it top down or cross, they all, right? If you look across, kinim written across, and then you look up down like a crossword puzzle, right? Top down, you can see that choshech, shchin, and kinam are all written together, right? If you look at all 3 letters, they're all mixed up, but they all work together, right? Isn't it fascinating? It's fascinating. Anyway, so he says here, he says Moshe couldn't, based on this, he says Moshe could not have warned Paro on one of these makot by itself, without mentioning the other 2, because basically they all need each other, right? He says because the other 2 makot were served together with it.
Cool.
Yeah, it is cool, right? God forbid, had Moshe warned him about the makav choshech or shchin or kinim individually, he would have said, I'm about to bring choshech, right? But he really meant to say, I'm about to bring 1, which is really 3. So he didn't want, God forbid, Hashem didn't want to view Moshe, or didn't want Moshe to be viewed as, God forbid, a liar. We're in Torah Yud Zayin, which is the last one of Parshat Vayera, and it's just a very quick one, just to kind of like, as I've said, prime the pump. right? So it's a quick one as to why Choshech, Kinim, and Shchin don't have warnings. So if you look at the way he sets it up, it's based on the Yalkut Ravini, and he says basically like this. Then therefore, he couldn't also do is he couldn't possibly warn Paro on all three makot, meaning saying is Shchin is coming, but Kinim and Choshech are also coming at the same time. Because each one had its own specific time. So he says the Zera Shimshon, a very simple quote unquote, understanding of what's going on in these three makot, the three makot that don't have any warning. He says that based on the fact that if you just line them up, Kinim, Shchin, and Choshech, one on top of another, you'll see that each one of them basically you can create the other ones based on the way that you line them up in this way. Yes, sir.
But if he only gave an indication of each plague on its own, Paro would never know the other two and make the connection.
Until the third time around.
Until the third time around, right?
Exactly. And at that point, fine. But
So that, I think what he's trying to say is it's more of like just like a. I think he's saying I think what he's trying to say is yes, you're right. Paro could not have understood the fact that one means three, right? Meaning one equals three, which is what he's trying to say here. But I think what he's trying. I think again, my understanding of the Zera Shimshon is very limited. But I think he's trying to say is that there has to be a reason, a connection between, or not connection, but it has to be a reason as to why these are the only three makot that don't have warning. And therefore he says is, I have to think about answers. So he says, well, one of the reasons that I think of, based on this, work of Kabbalah work, he says is that if you just line them up, that he just says is that it can't be by chance that Shchin, Choshech, and Kinim, or Kinam, as he calls it, line them up and they all work out that they create each other's words. So I think it's less about the fact that Paro, and also he didn't want Moshe, God forbid, to be called a liar by saying is one, which equals three, right? He wouldn't want to say that, or he's saying all three came, right? I think what he's trying to say is really more about the idea of that it's just an interesting association between these three makot that don't have any warning. That's really all of it, to my understanding. I'm sure that the Zera Shimshon himself would probably say something a little deeper than that, but.
at this point, did Hashem harden his heart at this point?
Yes, he did. He hardened himself.
So then
he hardened his heart after each one. But what he didn't do is Moshe didn't warn Paro about these three makot specifically. The other ones he said, you're about to get blood. You're about to
he
get.
couldn't have done tshuva anyway because Hashem hardened his heart.
Correct. That's a famous question in and of itself.
He didn't want to do
It's actually an interesting observation just to mention because the Zera Shimshon brings down, he singularizes the
Kinim, right?
So there's only one word. There's only one word in the Torah in Chamishi in Parshat.
That says Kinim, right?
It says Kinam.
Kinam, right? Yeah.
There's only one. Otherwise,
This is
Kinim
Kinim.
is plural
With the yud.
with the yud. Kinim,
Interesting.
No. The Kinim is two yuds, right? With one yud. sorry.
One yud, right?
And then there's another time where it's broken with two yuds. When there's only one place where you say the Kinam where you write it down.
Right. So that is an interesting point. So that's why it's obviously singular. So let's do. Okay, so that was the first one, just to get ourselves a little bit into things, and also to help Zev kind of go through things.
working on like 3 hours here.
I understand. I got it. Okay. Let's do. Let's see here. I had a few that I would like to do. Okay, let's do this one. Chet, number 8. Drush 8.
So going backwards?
We're going backwards. I know we're going out of order, but the first one was like a little bit like more like a. You always want to start with like an easy one that's a little bit more cute, kind of get people into things.
This is Chet.
Chet 8. So we'll start with number 8. We're not going to stop the recording because that first one was a little short. Let's just see here. Let's see. 10. Why do they do it in numerals? Okay, here we go. So this question is. It's a very good question, a very simple one. There's let's ask. We'll start with the midrash. The midrash says that a person, we know the famous the makat dam, it's Torah Chet 8. So the midrash tells us that during the makat dam, which is the first makkah, right? If a Jewish person had a barrel of water and the Egyptian would attempt to draw the water from the barrel, what would happen?
Turn to blood.
It would turn to blood. right? Even if a Jewish person and an Egyptian would drink from the same bowl, the Jewish person would drink water, and while the Egyptian would drink blood. The only way the Egyptian would be able to drink water was through purchasing the water from the Jewish person. As a result, what happens? The Jewish people have all of a sudden money. Okay, so that's the question, right? So now, if you look here, Midrash Rabbah, Hadaga Asher Bayor. Hadaga Asher Bayor Meta. Right? That's the pasuk is that it's in Shmot. The pasuk is in Shmot, Perik Tet, pasuk Tet. The fish that are in the Yaor Meta, meaning it's dead, dies. Right? Amar Bichanina. Mimakat dam ha'ishiru Yisrael shayu mochrim ma'im lemitzrayim makshima olam ma'inyan drasha zo pasuk zeh dafka b'echi remiza. So he says the Midrash says that the Jewish people became rich or became wealthy from makat dam, right? Because they would sell water to the Egyptians. Okay. Now the question is, every person Zera Shimshon asks, the Midrash is talking about the fact that the Jews made money out of the bloody water, right? Because they were able to monetize it. Okay, great. Now the question is, what is the pasuk that says about Dagasher Bayor Meta? How does that infer or imply that the Midrash? What is the association between the Midrash or the relationship between the Midrash saying that they made money from it to the pasuk that says that the fish died? Right. That's the question. Right. How is it?
What's the question again?
The question is, what does the narrative meaning? What is the midrash? What is the midrash, which is talking about the fact that the Jews made money out of the fact that they were selling the water, the clear water that they had, to the Egyptians, so that way they can then, drink water as opposed to drinking blood, right? How is that midrash understood, or how do we understand that midrash from the pasuk that says that the fish died in the water, in the blood? That's what he's asking. It's a very simple question. Nothing, nothing very large or very impressive. Right, the fact that the fish died, we derive that the Jewish people became wealthy. So how do we?
Why did the Jewish people need to become wealthy if they were going to become wealthy?
So he's going to answer that question as well. He's going to answer that answer the question as well. Great, good question. Right. So it says here, V'yesh lomar, shadavar yadua shebimidah she'adam oded ba modedim lo. Right. The person is that we know that there's a concept. This is actually based in Mishnah in Sotah. It says that it says that a person is treated by Hashem in the same way that he himself acts, right? So the more, that's one of the famous, right? Ma tarachum mahu rachum afatarachum. So if you are compassionate, so Hashem will also show compassion to you. God forbid if you do the opposite, Hashem will do the opposite to you too. Vinei hamitzrim hayu manichim et Yisrael atzud dagim, right? And we find that the Jewish people allowed the Egyptians allowed the Jewish people to catch their own fish. Vayu ochlim otam. So he makes a very interesting observation. Later on in Sefer Bamidbar, we see that Bnei Israel complain about their food, right, or the lack of regular food. They always complain about the fact that they only have man, and it says the word Zacharnu Tadaga Asher Nochal BeMitzrayim Chinam. Do we ever remember in the story of the slavery of Egypt, that we ever see that Bnei Israel actually had fish for free? No. So what the Zera Shimshon seems to imply, based on he says that he basically implies that the Egyptians would let the Bnei Israel fish in the water, in the Nile, for free. Meaning, if you want to go get your own food, go do it. It's all yours, no cost. That's why the pasuk says we remember the fish that we ate for free. Right? For this reason alone of treating the Egyptians, the fish should not have died, right? Because for this reason alone of treating the Egyptians, the fish should not have died. Right? More so, it would have been a great loss. Israel, it would have been a great loss for Bnei Israel if the fish actually died, right? They would no longer have access to fish that they could eat for free. And if the absence of fish that they want to eat other foods, they would have to go out and pay for their own food. Thus, there's a difficulty with the verse, right? It shouldn't have died. Why shouldn't the fish died? Because if the fish died, Bnei Israel would not have food to eat for free. So that's the question. He's really asking. He's saying is what the pasuk itself is problematic based on the future pasuk that's written in Bamidbar that says we ate for fish for free, right? If we understand that the Mitzrayim actually let Bnei Israel eat for free the fish, right? So then, God forbid, we should say that the fish died, Because if the fish died, that means what? Bnei Israel wouldn't have food to eat for free. And if they had to go get food, what would they have to do? Go out and find it and buy it and sell it and whatever. And therefore, it shouldn't have happened to die. The fish shouldn't have died. So therefore, the difficulty with this question, that's why it says, Lachen bar Rabbi Chanina, v'darash al pasuk zed dafka. That's why Rabbi Chanina comes specifically on this midrash. He brings his midrash specifically on this pasuk, as opposed to any other pasukim of Makatam. Shmi Makatam heshiru Yisrael. V'im kein lo hayu tzrichim od la'achol adagim b'chinam. Shoreish lahem ha'ot harbe liknot ma shetzrichim. He says, that's why Rabbi Chanina comes specifically on this pasuk and not any other pasukim to tell us that Bnei Israel made money from dam, from this pasuk, from this one specifically, so that if they needed any other food, they didn't even the food. It says that the fish died, and we just asked the question: how could it be the fish died if the fish dying would mean that Bnei Israel would no longer have free food? So he says no. That's why Rabbi Chanina comes into the midrash and says it's not that yes, the fish died, and that's why through the makah itself, meaning through the actual makah. Even though, yes, they used to have free fish, now they says, how did they make money now? Now that they used to have free fish, now they need to make money. How did they make money? They made money by selling the water that for them was water and to the Egyptians was blood. That's his first answer. His first answer, I think, is...
In a way, it also connects kind of well with manna because they got sick of just the manna.
Right.
Same thing, you get sick of just fish.
Right.
But now you no longer need just fish. Now
Exactly.
you can buy whatever you
Exactly.
want.
Exactly.
May I ask a question?
Yes.
So they had all this money, but with the other plagues, there were no animals.
We're going to get to another midrash later. We're going to ask a question as to about why the animals, which specific animals, and things like that. But yes, it's a good question. What are they going to buy, right? And what Egyptian is going to actually sell to these Bnei Israel?
And the other question I have is what currency did they use to buy it?
So that first of all,
If it was Egyptian currency, what use would it be after they leave Egypt?
right. So money is money. Right. So money is money. So usually, in the olden days, it wasn't the dollar. It wasn't a currency specific. It was gold or silver, whatever it was. So that's the first thing. So the gold and silver is usable anywhere. That's the first thing. And second thing is. Were the Egyptians going to sell them? We don't know, but the truth is that Bnei Israel lived in Goshen. They didn't live in Mitzrayim itself. They worked in Mitzrayim. I mean, they were enslaved in Mitzrayim, but they lived in Goshen. And the assumption is that they had their own kind of society and shopping and whatever. That's the assumption. I'm not just making that assumption now. That's an assumption that makes sense outside of this context. V'od yesh lifaresh. Let's say we can explain another question. Let's say there's no difficulty at all. That's about the fact that the fish died. So he says is let's ask give it another explanation. So he says here, based on what's that?
Is that blood?
Yeah, he left. He had to go out. He was didn't have enough. He said he didn't sleep a lot, so he left early. He just wanted to do a short one, so I started with the end, even though I probably should have ended with the end. But anyway, so he says. Now he says, go back to the pasuk that we mentioned about in Bamidbar. It says that we remember eating the fish for free in Egypt, in Mitzrayim. It doesn't mean that they actually eat fish, meaning for free, as we would read it as the shot of the pasuk, right? As it says, elachinam below mitzvot. This is a nice little piece. So he says, it's not that they literally ate it for free, meaning at no cost, meaning that they ate it. V'chinam means that they didn't have any mitzvot, right? V'chinam mitzvot, they were free of mitzvot. So he says here, mishum hachi metu adagim. According to the interpretation, the Jewish people, in fact, did not eat the fish for free, and for this reason, it was understood that the fish died. Shamitzrim lo haya lahem bahem shum zchut. The Egyptians had no merit to save the fish. Shelo natnim otam l'Yisrael b'chinam, since they did not give the Jewish people the fish for free. So the Jewish people did not lose anything through the death of the fish, since they had no way they had to pay for them in any event. So how then does the midrash infer? Right, and the question is, how does the midrash infer that the Bnei Israel became wealthy through the makah of blood? So he says, "Ein lakshot al pshat hakutuv." No one was asking about the simple meaning. Why is it necessary at all to tell us that the fish died? Right? It's obvious. Right? We know that the fish can only live in water.
But it's not so obvious because when the Jews drank the water, it was clear.
Very good. He's about to say something very similar to that. Of course, if everything turned to blood, if everything turned to blood, then it's obvious that the fish were going to die. It's not like some no one would be surprised if you didn't leave out the fact that it says the fish died, because the obvious answer is, of course they died. It's all blood, right? Fish need water. There's no water. Fish dead. That's it. What do we say? So he says so he says maybe perhaps we should say that even though the water changed to blood, it was not really blood. What does that mean? Really, it was still water. But what the Egyptians would draw out, it would look like blood, right? But that which the Jewish people would draw out was actually water. So the difference, like we said, we know that the Midrash we know that whatever the Jew touched was water, whatever the Egyptian touched was blood. So he's saying it wasn't actual blood, it just looked like blood.
Cherry flavor.
Yeah, exactly right. Food coloring, exactly.
Okay.
So, right, hold on. So if this was the case, the fish would also been able to survive, which would have been proper since they were the food of the Jewish people, right? So therefore, with regard to the fish, which was the food of the Jewish people, there was no reason for the water to change to blood. So therefore, the fish could have survived. And therefore, he's basically saying is that had the water essentially stayed water but turned into blood when it was drawn by the Egyptians would have been able to drink water drawn by a Jew without paying for it. But now that the water was essentially transformed into blood, it would turn back into water only for the benefit of the Jew. Basically, what he's saying is that there are two approaches. One approach is that that the fish did actually die. The fact that the fish did die indicates the Jewish people must have become wealthy, and therefore they were not affected by the loss of their free fish, but rather what happened is the water that they sold allowed them to become wealthy, and therefore what happened, that's the reason why the Midrash specifically is on this pasuk as opposed to any other pasuk. That's one option. The other one would not cause a loss to those people because in fact they did not. In fact, is that he says here that it was only for a Jew that the blood miraculously turned back into water. Hashem brought the plague into this manner to force the Egyptians to purchase their water from the Jewish people. That is, the river actually turned into blood if the Egyptian would take a Jewish person's water. Okay, so basically he's saying tells us that the Jewish people became wealthy through selling the water to the Egyptians, meaning that yes, the fish actually died, but what happened is that the Egyptian saw the water and he thought it was blood. Even when he took it out, it looked like blood. But when the Jewish person saw it and took it out, it was water. And therefore the fish survived. Why did the fish survive? The fish survived because it was actually water. It never actually turned into blood.
So when no one looks at it, why does it matter?
That's a good question. That's a good question.
Okay, so you think, I'm being very,
Cynical?
you don't think that there was one Egyptian guy who drank that, what looked like blood, and said, oh, it's just red, but it's water?
I don't know. I don't like to go too much into the deeper fake news. You're right. Fake news. All right. So
you know what the wealthiest country in the world is? Believe it or not?
Qatar, Egypt.
Canada.
Yeah, right.
They have over 800,000 lakes, fresh water,
Wow.
which is more than the entire rest of the world combined.
Wow.
Okay, so let's do. Oh,
Should we do a new recording?
yeah. We'll stop in a second. Yeah, we'll stop this one, and then
So we're going to do a new Torah, everyone join.
in a second. I'm just going to grab some food. Then.
I'll move back to Canada.
I'm going to find one more, which is a little bit longer. Let me just find it. A lot of good short ones here.
Do you want me to grab you some food?
Yeah. Thank you, if you don't mind.
What would you like?
No, whatever.
Little
Meals for Heroes sweatshirt.
Is that?
You know, we're catching up. He's like, what is that? What's Meals for Heroes? מה זה עובד? איך זה עובד? מה זאת אומרת? אז סיפרתי לו. I told him.
What is that?
Base, Torah base, with Zusha's yacht site. Let's do it.
Oh, we're starting recording.
Rosh Chodesh Shvat. What's today? Now we're already in base Shvat.
All right. So in this week's parsha, the first few psukim, it says Moshe. It says what is it? It's like pasuk itself.
You have a shmot here.
There we go. I got it.
You got it?
It says here. In order to understand, I'm purposely reading from the psukim beforehand to understand what happened. the context of this on the tail or at the end of last week's parsha, Moshe gives a little bit of a chutzpah answer. Oh, Simon, what's up?
Yes.
Hey, Shimon.
Oh.
All right,
What's happening, dude?
it's Sakal Junior. All right. So in the end of last week's parsha, we know that Hashem, that Moshe gives a little bit of like a chutzpahdik answer. It says, God, you sent me here to Paro. They take the Jews out of Egypt, and as soon as I walk in there, Paro doubles down. He gets upset. He makes things worse for them. Lama ariyota, lama zeh. Right? That's what Moshe says. Me'az bati el Paro.
Translate to why what?
Why would you make it worse? Like, why make it worse for them? Like how lam yosam ra. Right? From the moment Me'az bati el Paro ledaber b'shmecha rala amazeh. Ratzil lo yitzalta tamecha. He says, with chutzpah, he kind of says, how could it be that as soon as you tell me to go into Mitzrayim to go save your nation, not only did I not save them, it made it worse. So in that context, it says, in this week's parsha, it says, Vayidaber Elohim Moshe Vayomer Elav Ani Hashem. Right? And he says, Elohim, which is Lashon, right, kind of justice, Din, right? So Moshe kind of Hashem tries to give Moshe a little bit of like a little bit of musar, right? And he says that you shouldn't have asked him that way. So now, based on this kind of the juxtaposition between the two psukim and the two parts of the parsha, meaning even though the two parshas are separated, we really have to view it as one kind of storyline. And so, what we have to do now is the Zera Shimshon quotes a Midrash Rabbah from this parsha on the pasuk in Kohelet. The pasuk in Kohelet says, "Ufanit ani l'rot b'chochma ha'ledut v'sichlut, ma she'ayiti machkim u'mareh la'atzmi shani yodea dat Torah." He says here, Kohelet says, "Paniti ani l'rot." I turned paniti, and I saw myself in the wisdom and madness, and I saw that all of this was basically sichlut, meaning it's all nothingness. Ma she'ayiti machkim. Right, Shlomo Melech says about himself that which I saw to apply my wisdom to the words of the Torah. So he says, I persuaded myself that I know the intent. I know that what the Torah is trying to say. That knowledge and understanding were actually madness and folly. Meaning, what does he mean to say? He's basically saying is that I thought that I was above the Torah. Why? What did Hashem give Shlomo HaMelech? The gift of wisdom. Right? So Hashem says, well then Shlomo Melech incorrectly says, well if Hashem gave me the wisdom, then I'm above the wisdom that everyone else has. And therefore what is he trying to say? Now you'll say, what is he trying to say? For what can man who comes after the king do? They have already done it. Right? Considering that his ways are matters that are already kind of done beforehand. For they have already done it, meaning that anything Hashem does, he first confers with, right, he speaks to his entourage, so he's basically saying is that Shlomo HaMelech says that I received the gift from Hashem, the gift of knowledge. And since I know the gift of knowledge, who does Hashem, before Hashem gives something out, he talks to his Beit Din, he talks to the Palmal Yashamala, right? And he says that once his judgment is true, right, then he says every word of Hashem is refined, and therefore it's a matter decreed by angels. So we have a question. Zera Shimshon asks a question. He says, why we should not be questioned? Anything that the Torah gives us, anything the Torah says, we should not question. Anything that happens, anything that Hashem does, is already been kind of conferred upon by the Malachim. Is it permissible to ask the question? Yes, sir.
I just have one. Everything you just described now, from beginning to end, tell me if I'm wrong. Everything that you just described now is ego.
Yes, that's correct. Exactly right.
Okay.
Absolutely, 100%. Shlomo HaMelech is actually saying You're correct.
See, I knew the answer because my
Right.
wisdom is so far superior.
Exactly. That's exactly what. That is exactly. By the way, that is exactly the entire. If I had to summarize the entire Torah, which is
Ego.
quite long, it's about ego. It's Shlomo Melech incorrectly, and he admits to the incorrection.
Well, the opposite. Bittul.
Right. He incorrectly assumes, which we already know
In
that.
hindsight.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. He says it's in hindsight. Right. He realizes that at first he assumed at first that because he was given the gift of wisdom, that he's above the wisdom that everyone else gets because I'm smarter than that person. So he says, now you're going to get to the next part, which is really the interesting part. So what is the whole point here? So the Zera Shimshon asks one question is, right, the fact that he says there's two problems with this whole midrash. There's many problems with the midrash, but he points out two. One is, the first problem, as he says, is that are we allowed to at all ever question Hashem's ways? Even if, let's just say, he says, well, the midrash says that anything that Hashem says, he first tells the court, the divine court, and then after he tells the divine court, then it happens. So therefore, if it wasn't told to the divine court, does that mean that human beings are allowed to ask and question Hashem's ways? No, not at all. So he says that obviously not. So now he asks the question. So he says like this: V'yesh lomar, sheshlomo haya sover sho'il chochmato nitla min hashamayim chutz min hateva. Like I said, Shlomo initially thought, like you said, incorrectly or egotistically, perhaps, if we understand what was going on here, right? Since the wisdom that he was given to him was from heaven, meaning it was a supernatural gift, right? So he says, well, if I'm smarter than the average person, I've got a supernatural wisdom. Therefore, what? Then my heart will not be astrayed by marrying so many women. That's what he says. I will what? I'll get married to many, many women, and don't worry about it. I'll be fine. Like everyone says, I'll be okay. Everyone else, it's my problem. Don't worry about it. I got it. Right? I got this one. Omnam lachar she'ergish b'atzmo shechata shenashav hisurat levavo hoda b'fiv v'shema shenira lo shechachmata yitira sha'ar b'nei adam lo haya ele holilut. He realizes for himself. He realizes, and if you look in the Gemara, right, he says, and he admits, like you said, he admitted to the fact afterwards. He says, not only did I make a mistake, but he realized my wives themselves, the women themselves, are the ones that went astray. Meaning he said, like, I tried to outsmart Hashem, or outsmart other people. He says, well, I'm not going to fall, God forbid, to that, right? So, because I got a supernatural gift, right? But he realizes that not only did that happen, but what happened is that the women themselves that he tried to outsmart, because he said, well, the women, what happens, what's the king's commandment? Don't have too many horses, don't have too many wives, always walk around with the Sefer Torah, right? Those are basically the three, there's a couple more. But anyway, so he says, well, the Torah knows a normal king shouldn't have too many wives. But I'm not a normal king. I got the wisdom from the king, right? The King of Kings. So if I got the wisdom from the King of Kings, then I'll outsmart the Torah. So he says, well, then what happens? His women himself, the women that Shlomo HaMelech married, he realizes and admits to himself. He says, there's a problem, right? So therefore, he says he admits what I did was a mistake. Okay, now
Not as smart as he thought.
exactly
Right behind you, they say. I've heard this from a few different sources.
behind me.
Like sitting, like right behind where you're sitting. You can't see it.
No.
But in the valley there, they say it was the palace where Shlomo HaMelech kept his wives.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Really?
I made my bat mitzvah in Ari's house right here on the valley, and thank you very much again. And it was beautiful. The energy, like it was different. Like it was so energized,
Brechot Shlomo down there.
and it created a whole effect. And all the other minors, all the girls,
You'll see that there's
but not
like
Yisrael. They all
like
made their bat
some
mitzvah
big
similar kind of
palace or
vibe.
something.
Like
Have you
in
noticed
a
that palace
house,
back there?
more like cost effective,
I get the Beitar view. I don't get the
And it was
view from here.
because the energy was good. It
Anyway,
wasn't
so now he
the
says.
venue and all the fancy stuff. But maybe this helped with Shlomo Melech's.
Now he says here, for what? So now he asks the question. What the reason that it was foolish, says the Midrash, is for what can a man who comes after the king do? For a person cannot question Hashem's decrees, right? Because what happens once there are decrees, right? You can't and claim that the particular decree is not good for him. It's good for him, but not good for me, or I'm better than that decree. You can't do that. Kol ma shehu oseh, terem unim lach b'pal ma'ashem k'dei sheyedu v'ya'idu shedino din emet. So basically he says is that we are not allowed to question what happens. Even though, and he brings the proof from the Midrash of Shlomo Melech, he says Shlomo Melech made a mistake, trying to outsmart the king. Right? He thought that he was above the Torah, quote unquote, whatever that means. And so the reason why I thought it was relevant to today is because sometimes during difficult moments that we see, both personally as a nation, sometimes we question what's going on. And even though it's very hard to not question, sometimes we have to kind of just say, we don't know what's really the big master plan is. And we have to kind of say, yes, and it's meant to be a wake-up call for us, but it's also not meant for us to say, God, what's going on here? We're allowed to ask, but we really shouldn't go too deep where we have to really undo everything. But I'm not done yet.
Great Torah for today.
Exactly. That's exactly right. So that's one of the reasons why. And by the way, I have to give credit to Charles, even though he's not here. I said, Charles, what am I going? He called me this morning at 5 o'clock. He's like, "You want to cover 5 o'clock in the morning?" He goes, "You want to?" He texted me. He goes, "You want to cover today?" I was like, "Now you tell me." So I said, "Well, I went through a lot of the Torahs already this week, but I don't look into it deeply." And then he's like, last week I got a chance to look at the art. I borrowed the art scroll, so I had a little bit more of a heads up. This week I didn't even do that, but. So I didn't even have that. So he said you should do Torah bet. So I give Charles a lot of credit for this one. All right. So now, now we're going to go into the same. We're going to continue this thing. We're going to go a little bit. So we're going to go to. Where is it? Hold on a second here. There's a part here. Okay. Where are we? Okay. Okay, so now go towards the end of the same drush, the same Torah.
Torah bets, yeah.
We're still in Torah bet. Towards the end, there's a paragraph that's about, I think, it says V'derech zeh. V'derech zeh. It's like 4 or 5 paragraphs from the end of the actual.
Hebrew edition is page Tov Kuf Samech Tes.
Right, and if in the English one, it's on page 239 at the last few lines of the page. V'derech zeh yavoar. So he says here,
Midrash, yeah.
further, the whole idea that leads us, the whole idea of judging an erroneous calculation, meaning the whole idea here is that, and he goes through it very deep. He continues on for quite a while, the Zera Shimshon, but I'm skipping intentionally, and he says that basically the whole thing here, the whole concept and the whole premise of this whole Torah is that it was a mistake. Shlomo Melech made a mistake, similar to what Moshe Rabbeinu last week's Parshat. He made a mistake too. He got upset. Sometimes we do that. We get upset at a moment, or we think that we're above the situation, or we don't understand the full picture, right? As it says, right? What do we say? Minametza karati. We're in a very constricted point of view. We call out to you, and then what happens? Hashem answers us by giving us the fuller picture, right? We start seeing the fuller picture. But when you're in the moment, you get stuck in that very narrow-minded thing. And so what Moshe got, whatever it means, Moshe was in a bad situation at that moment, and he only saw that thing. So in this case, what happens? He says like this. He says, now we can understand about the whole idea of Shlomo Melech's sin. It says here there's a Yalkut Shimoni that's very, very strange. He says, it says at the end, at the end of his life, and if this is based on a Yalkut Shimoni that's in Sefer Melachim Aleph, it says that when Shlomo got old, his wives swayed his heart. The Midrash says, Amar Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, Alta Yud v'nishtata lifnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The letter Yud arose and prostrated himself in front of Hashem. Amra lefanav, it said before him, that is the Yud, the letter Yud says, Ribbono shel olam, hakatavta b'toratcha ot echat levatala. Have you written one letter in the Torah that was for nothing? Meaning, are you going to even waste one letter? Amar Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, Allah Sefer Mishneh Torah lifnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The book of Mishneh Torah, that is the book of Devarim, came up and said to Hashem, Ribbono shel olam, Shlomo mevakesh lakoret Yud mimeni. Behold, Shlomo has wished to uproot the letter Yud from me. Amar la Kodesh Baruch Hu. Shlomo batel Chayecha, Shlomo batel, Shlomo will be wiped out. Umeya kayotzebo, and 100 like him. Vot achat ina betila ad kan l'shano, and not one letter will be wiped out from you. Meaning, it's a very strange esoteric midrash. So he says, "It's kfar manu shemalachei hasharet enam danin et adam ela ala maaseh." The ministering angels, that is the malachim hasharet, malachei hasharet, don't judge a person or only judge a person for the actual deed. Omnar lachar maaseh oneh b'machshava ba'ah b'milah. Meaning, after the punishment for the sinful intent comes automatically. So what happens is that although the judges, that is the malachim, judge Shlomo for committing a sinful act, his punishment for the intent had yet to be determined. V'chan lichora yesh lomar. The Shlomo did not sin in his thought. He did not intend to transgress what he said, what happened there. In other words, he made a mistake in his thought, in his thinking. Right? His reasoning was wrong. He thought that he made a mistake, saying is that, yes, I merited to have an upper level of wisdom, so my thought process was wrong. In other words, his starting point was wrong. It wasn't that he was doing it maliciously to go out and marry 100 women, 1,000 women because I don't care what the Torah says. He says that his mindset was my logic and my thought process was, if my wisdom was such a great wisdom, then I can be almost like above the Torah. Now, I'm not. Of course, that means that it's wrong. Meaning his thought process was wrong. But the Zera Shimshon seems to imply that it's like a shogeg. It was by accident. Meaning his thought was wrong.
Wasn't the thought process including the fact that he wanted to make peace with all the nations around him, and all of these individual women were, he married the daughter of Paro.
Right.
And the other Queen of Sheba, etc., etc.
It could be. You're right. In other words, he made it. The whole thought process was like, if I'm above the law already by being smarter than everyone else, so then I'll also try to do is make peace with the nations by marrying every one of the nations, and therefore I'll outsmart the nations that way too.
Or you could say some people are too smart for their own good.
Exactly. So that's what I think he's trying. If you had to summarize the whole portion, the whole Torah into one few letters, it says you're too smart for your own good. Meaning you outsmart yourself by, outdoing your own logic, kind of thing.
The Torah doesn't hold you culpable for thinking.
Right. He doesn't. No. So that's what he says here. He's right.
Christianity, if you think something, you're evil. You really transgress.
Right. So
Judaism.
Right. You don't exactly. That's exactly right. You only got to the maaseh. Once you're punished for the maaseh, then the machshava comes. The intent comes too. Right. You get the intent too. It's not that you don't get punished. You're right for the intent. But once the punishment,
different things today. But
what? I know, right? No, if you don't take action, great. That's great. But sometimes what happens is the machshava turns you into, once you're thinking of something that turns into action, and that action, right? Then what happens? Exactly. So exactly. You started. The intent comes at the end. So now let's see what he says here. Omnam, the letter Yud arose before Hashem. Hayud ala machshava nemra. Now, when the letter Yud appeared as a prefix to a verb, thus making a future, it is stated to reference the point of the person performing the action. So look what happens. If you look at the pasuk Az Yashir Moshe, the word Yashir, will sing. A Yud has a very interesting ability to do something. Yud is the only letter that if you put it in front of something, it's going to happen, right? Ani Oseh, and when I put a Yud, right? Ani Yaseh, I will do. It means future tense, right? So the same thing with Yashir Moshe. Az Yashir, he will sing. Right? So it means that everything that he will Moshe.
Everything starts with the Yud first.
Yeah, exactly. Everything starts with the Yud first. It's a future. It's a Yud is the only one that can do something, turns it into a future. B'vadai chata Shlomo. Right? Shlomo should not have been judged as merely erring in his calculation, for he certainly did sin in his thought. Shayalo lachshov shayud al shem ha'machshava ne'emra. Right? Lo yar belo nashim. The word, the isur for the king is don't have too many wives. In reference to a thought. Every time, every reason, every thought process to have too many wives, in regard to any thought that might occur to the king as a valid basis to have too many wives, meaning what happens, he says, is if you look at the pasuk lo yarbe lo nashim, lo yarbe means it's not even on the thought process. If a king even thinks, right, even if he thinks about the fact that he's going to have too many, he can outsmart the thing, or even if he thinks that he can have more than a certain number of wives, that the Torah is coming to tell him is even that thought process he's eligible for punishment because the Torah itself says lo yarbe, right? With the yud, that yud there says you shouldn't have too many, and even the thinking of trying to have too many is already a problem. Now he says the last part, which is Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, about the whole idea of Sefer Bamidbar coming and saying is what's going on here. Nakat Davka Sefer Mishnah Torah. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says he says specifically chose, according to the Zera Shimshon, he specifically chose the Mishnah Torah, that is the Sefer Dvarim. Why did I say Bamidbar? Sefer Dvarim. So he says, what happens in the mitzvah of Hakel? Hakel happens at the end of Shnat Shemitah. The Kohen gathers all the Bnei Israel in front of the Beit HaMikdash, and he says, right? What happened is the king the king would come read in front of Bnei Israel the whole Sefer Dvarim, from Sefer Eila Dvarim till the Shema Yisrael, right? Then he would skip and read Hayah Yishma. These are the psukim that are meant to encourage people to perform mitzvot, right? And strengthen them to their hands in religion. That's why specifically the Sefer of Dvarim came in front of Hashem. He's saying is, you can't have a king stand in front of Bnei Israel and say, let's do better, perform mitzvah better, if the king himself didn't do the mitzvah himself. Like you can't, the person who's, you can't be your own, you can't say to one person, you can't say one thing to one person and not do it yourself, right? You have to be a role model.
You can't preach what you don't.
Right, exactly. You can't. Thank you. Right. If you don't practice what you preach, then you can't be the preacher. Right. So in other words, he's not. It can't be that Shlomo HaMelech is going to stand in front of the nation at Hakel and say, "Everyone do bar mitzvot," and everyone's like, "Dude, what's going on? You're not listening to the words you're reading." So he says here, "Al derech yitkosh shuva kosh," and this is in line with improve yourselves and improve each other. Right? Shlomo lo daish lo nizdarez. However, Shlomo not only failed to stir himself to keep mitzvot, el adrab avala mitzvot. Rather, he transgressed the mitzvot. So what is he trying to say here? If we have to look at it quickly, it's basically the pasuk. There's a midrash based on the fact that we have to look at last week's parsha and this week's parsha in a little bit of a context of that Moshe Rabbeinu, whatever it means, sort of was a little bit chutzpahdik in what he said. And the similar idea is that he kind of questioned, if you will, Moshe Rabbeinu kind of questioned Hashem's ways. And in that same vein, the Midrash says that Shlomo HaMelech also questioned Hashem's ways by trying to outsmart what Hashem did. When Hashem gave him a gift, the ultimate gift of wisdom, and Shlomo HaMelech says, I'm better than that wisdom. So if I'm better than that wisdom, then I can outsmart it by doing what? By marrying more than the commanded number of wives. And then he goes back, and this whole thing, the Zera Shimshon goes through this whole idea that Shlomo HaMelech miscalculated this whole thing. And of course, it was, like you said, it was an ego thing. He thought it was all about him. And he miscalculated, whatever this means, I don't fully understand, but he miscalculated the whole thing. And he notices that in Kohelet, he admits to the fact. He realizes that whatever I thought was that I could outsmart the smartest guy, I was wrong. It was a mistake. And he said that the thing that I thought I could outsmart, which is the women, I could outsmart because I could think that I could marry as many women as not a problem for me. The women themselves were the ones that actually caused me to falter towards the end of my life. And then he says, then based on that, the Zera Shimshon goes a little further and he brings this very esoteric midrash, and that the midrash explains two things. One is that why the letter Yud. The letter Yud is because the letter Yud has this ability to change something from a present to a future, and the Torah itself, the Yud from the Yarben Lo Nashim, the Yud from Yarben Lo Nashim is trying to tell us that the king himself, every time he even thinks, meaning in the future, he potentially could outsmart something. That's why the Yud came. That's what the Zera Shimshon says. And then he says the other part of the Midrash is Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says that the whole Sefer Dvarim came to testify against Hashem, against Shlomo HaMelech in front of Hashem. And he says, why is Sefer Dvarim? Because Sefer Dvarim is where the king stands in front of the whole nation and encourages them to perform mitzvah better. And he says, you can't stand, God forbid, would a king stand in front of all Bnei Israel, say you should do something if he himself can't be the one, is not the one doing it.
It has to be a role model.
Exactly. It has to be a role model. And like I said, we can't question the acts of Hashem or the things that Hashem does. We don't always understand we don't understand the full context. And also, as a general, that's one lesson for the day and for this what's going on nowadays. The second thing is for ourselves is that when we do things, we also have to recognize that not only are we role models for the people around us, specifically our family, whatever that may be, but also people around us who are not our family, that we look around and people look at us, and even more so to the nations around the world, we have to act as role models. So when we recognize that we are children of the King, right, and we're princes, we have to act like princes and not always act like unfortunately sometimes like fools. V'hamevin yavin, as they say. Baruch Adonai Le'olam, Amen ve'Amen.
Wow.
Shkoyach. Shabbos.